The sun burned low over the Sonoran Desert, painting the mesas in streaks of gold and crimson. Wind scoured the dry riverbeds, stirring dust and whispering secrets through the cacti. An Apache scout moved cautiously along the parched earth, eyes sharp for signs of danger or hope. Then he saw it, a burlap sack, half buried and trembling in the dirt as if something inside were alive. His hand froze over the coarse fibers. Heart pounding, he knelt and brushed away the grit. A soft, trembling voice pierced the stillness. "Mama," the single word stopped him cold. The desert seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, the wind itself fell silent. Somewhere in that sack, buried in the dirt and fear, was a connection he hadn't felt in years and a decision he could not ignore. Asterisk. Before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If video like and share, then fulfill your wish. Asterisk. The sun hung low over the Sonoran Desert, casting long, jagged shadows across the parched earth. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, catching the last golden rays as it drifted between the cacti and scattered scrub. The desert was quiet, except for the faint scrape of wind against stone, a sound so soft it could be mistaken for nothing at all or for a warning. An Apache scout moved through this landscape with careful precision, every footstep deliberate, every sense alert. He had traveled this desert countless times, yet each visit reminded him how unforgiving it could be. A misstep could mean a twisted ankle. A moment of carelessness could bring a rattlesnake strike or the surprise of soldiers patrolling the area. His eyes, sharp and trained, scanned the ground for anything unusual, any subtle sign that the desert might be hiding a secret. That's when he saw it. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a clump of dirt, half buried and shifting slightly. But instinct prickled at the back of his neck. The earth had moved, subtly, almost deliberately. His hand tightened around the strap of his bow as he crouched lower, brushing away the sun-baked soil with his fingers. The object revealed itself, a burlap sack, worn and frayed, but unmistakably alive with motion. It twitched as if the wind itself were coaxing it to move, but the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful to be caused by air. The scout's heart quickened. In this desert, a buried object could mean many things. A trap set by hostile men, a stolen bundle, or even a creature left to die. And yet, there was something different about this sack, something that drew him closer despite the danger. His instincts told him to be careful, to watch, to weigh each motion as he knelt beside it. Dust and pebbles fell through his fingers as he dug lightly around the sack, exposing more of its coarse, weathered surface. The cord that tied it was thin but strong, frayed at the edges, as if it had endured harsh days in the sun just like him. The desert seemed to grow still around him, the wind holding its breath as if waiting for what would come next. The scout's pulse echoed in his ears. He felt the weight of anticipation settle heavy in his chest. Then the movement came again, subtle, insistent, almost human. The scout froze. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. What could be inside? A small animal? A lost traveler? Or something more fragile, something that might plead silently for help? The suspense clung to him, urging him forward while warning him back. He paused, hands hovering over the sack, feeling the coarse fibers beneath his fingertips. In the desert, moments like this were rare, moments where the ordinary dirt and burlap became extraordinary. Every instinct screamed caution, but another, quieter voice inside him whispered curiosity, compassion, and a sense of duty. Whatever lay in that sack had a story, a heartbeat, a reason for being buried in the dirt, and as he hesitated, the desert seemed to lean in closer. The wind stilled, and for the first time that day, he felt the desert's silence press against him like a warning and a promise. Something was inside the sack, something that could change everything. With careful, deliberate movements, the Apache scout prepared to uncover it, unaware that the next sound he would hear a single, trembling word would stop him cold and set the course of his journey forever. The Apache scout's hands hovered over the rough burlap, the coarse fibers scratching against his palms. Every muscle in his body was taut, a coiled spring of caution and curiosity. The desert around him, the wind, the distant cries of coyotes, the trembling shadows of cacti seemed to fade, leaving only the sack and the question of what it held. He knelt lower, brushing the remaining dirt away. The sack was heavier than he expected, its weight uneven as if something inside shifted with every slight movement. His fingers traced the frayed cord that bound it, feeling the wear of time and the harshness of exposure. Slowly, deliberately, he began to untie it, each tug careful, mindful of the fragile life or the danger hidden within. The knot gave way with a soft snap, and the top of the burlap sagged. He hesitated, heart hammering. Inside, the movement grew more pronounced, a tiny shiver against the fabric. The scout's breath caught. His instinct screamed that this could be a trap, a trick to draw him in, but another, quieter instinct told him to keep going. Something alive, small and vulnerable, was waiting. Then he lifted the flap. Inside, cradled in a bundle of tattered cloth, was a child. Small, pale, and trembling, the child's eyes were wide with terror and confusion, staring up at him with the raw honesty only the very young can show. The desert's harshness seemed to have left its mark, the child's face streaked with dirt and tears, but there was a spark of life, a fragile presence that refused to be crushed. Before the scout could speak, the child whispered a single word, soft and fragile, yet somehow cutting through the thick air of the desert. Mama. The word struck him like a physical blow. Time slowed. The wind stilled. The desert itself seemed to lean in, listening. That single syllable carried so much weight loss, longing, and a memory he had thought buried like the child itself. For a moment, the Apache scout froze, unable to process the sound. It wasn't just a cry for a mother. It was a tether, a connection that reached back into his own past, brushing against the parts of himself he had tried to forget. The child whimpered and shifted, seeking reassurance, and the scout felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest. Compassion, fear, and awe intertwined in a dizzying mix. He realized the sack had not only hidden the child from the world, but had also hidden the truth from him, the possibility that this fragile life depended entirely on him. He reached slowly, hands steady despite the pounding of his heart, and lifted the child into his arms. Tiny fingers clung to his tunic, and the soft weight pressed against him, startling in its reality. The child repeated the word again, Mama. This time, the scout understood that it wasn't a plea for him, but a plea for safety, for protection, for connection. And suddenly, the choice was clear. The desert could no longer be a place of mere survival. It was now a place where responsibility, courage, and the fragile bonds of humanity were laid bare. He tucked the child closer and scanned the horizon, knowing that danger could approach at any moment. Yet in that instant, in that quiet moment under the dying sun, nothing mattered more than the small life in his arms and the single word that had shattered his world and rebuilt it in the same breath. Mama. The Apache scout held the child close, feeling the fragile pulse of life against his chest. The desert around them remained silent, as if it too were watching, waiting. He expected tears, cries, or panic, but instead, the child spoke again, this time louder, more insistent, the single word echoing with raw emotion. Mama. It wasn't a simple plea. It was a declaration of need, a tether to someone or something lost. The word carried weight far beyond its syllables, reaching into the scout's memory like a ghost he had long tried to bury. For a moment, he couldn't move. Every instinct he had honed in the desert, every cautious step, every shadow he had learned to read, faltered under the power of that tiny voice. The child's eyes were wide and searching, scanning his face for recognition, for reassurance. The scout realized that this word was not meant for him, yet somehow it had fallen upon him, demanding attention. Compassion surged unexpectedly, mingled with fear. Who had left this child here in the unforgiving desert, and why? How long had they been alone, buried in a sack, surviving against impossible odds? He shifted slightly, careful not to startle the child, and spoke softly. "It's all right. You're safe now." The words felt strange, heavy, almost inadequate in the face of the child's simple cry. Yet the voice, gentle and measured, seemed to ease the child just enough to quiet the trembling. Small hands clutched at his tunic, holding on with desperation and trust, a fragile bond forming in the silence of the desert. The scout's mind raced. Every step now mattered. Where would he go? What dangers lay ahead, and how could he protect a life so small and fragile? But for the first time, the desert didn't feel entirely empty. This child's presence made the harsh, sun-baked land suddenly alive with purpose. The soft sound of a voice, so human and urgent, turned a barren place into a landscape of possibility, hope, and responsibility. The word "mama" repeated softly, almost rhythmically, and the scout realized that the child wasn't simply calling for a mother. They were clinging to a memory, a hope, a life that had been interrupted. Each repetition of the word tugged at him, reminding him of connections he had lost and choices he had made. He felt a strange kinship with the child, as though the desert had delivered not just a helpless figure, but a mirror of vulnerability and courage. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the life the child had known, the world beyond the desert, and the danger that must have led them to be hidden in the sack. Each possibility filled him with determination. He could not leave the child here, alone in this vast, unforgiving expanse. The voice had anchored him, given him a purpose beyond mere survival. The Apache scout adjusted the child in his arms, careful to shield them from the wind that now carried the faint scent of distant wildflowers and dry earth. The desert, relentless and vast, was still waiting, but he felt ready. Whatever lay ahead, heat, predators, or human threats, he would face it, guided by that single, trembling word, "Mama." In that moment, the desert transformed from a place of isolation into a stage for survival, trust, and connection. And as the child's small voice continued to call out into the empty air, the scout understood something he hadn't known before. Some lives, some moments, could not be ignored. No matter how barren the world seemed, the child's whisper "Mama" lingered in the air like smoke, twisting through the desert wind and wrapping around the Apache scout's mind. He froze, the movement of the child in his arms slowed as if time itself had paused. That simple word, soft and trembling, carried a weight that struck deeper than any physical danger he had faced in the desert. Memories he had buried rose suddenly, unbidden. A face, worn yet familiar, flashed in his mind, someone he had known, someone he had lost, someone whose voice had once called to him in moments of desperation. His chest tightened, a cold knot forming that threatened to pull the breath from his lungs. The desert, vast and indifferent moments ago, now felt claustrophobic, pressing him into the reality of recognition. He looked down at the child again. The resemblance was subtle yet undeniable, the curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the same trembling lip when fear or hope touched the heart. Could it be? His mind refused to leap fully, too scared to grasp the truth. Yet the pieces began to fit together with an almost unbearable clarity. The word "Mama" repeated, smaller this time, almost as a question, and something in the scout's chest shattered and reformed at once. He realized the child had survived the desert, survived abandonment or danger, and now was in his arms. And he had been part of the chain of events that led to this moment, part of the story that had left this child alone and afraid. Guilt and awe collided in him. Every step he had taken, every choice he had made in the past that had distanced him from the people he cared about, seemed to converge in this one moment. Recognition was no longer abstract, it was tangible, pressing, immediate. The desert was no longer just a landscape of survival. It had become a mirror reflecting his past failures, his regrets, and now, perhaps, a chance at redemption. The child squirmed slightly, instinctively sensing the tension radiating from him. The scout swallowed hard, fighting to steady his breathing and his voice. He leaned down, lowering his forehead to meet the child's gaze, and whispered, I know, little one. I know." His voice cracked, raw with emotion, carrying the weight of years he had tried to forget. For the first time, the scout allowed himself to feel the full magnitude of the moment. Recognition was not just knowing, it was responsibility, connection, and a moral reckoning all at once. The child's small, fragile body in his arms was a reminder of what had been lost, and what could still be protected. The desert wind picked up, brushing dust across their faces, yet he no longer noticed. The only thing that mattered was the life in his arms, and the word that had pierced his soul, Mama. A word that should have been simple, innocent, was now a catalyst for remembrance, awakening, and resolve. He understood, with sudden clarity, that the path forward was no longer about solitude or survival. It was about connection, about protecting what had been nearly lost, about facing the consequences of the past and making a choice that could redefine the future for both him and the child. The scout tightened his hold, feeling a determination settle in his chest. The desert could be cruel, unrelenting, and indifferent, but he would not be. Recognition had struck, and with it came purpose. And the child, whispering that haunting, beautiful word, had become the compass guiding him through the barren land. The desert stretched endlessly around them, its heat and silence a constant reminder of the dangers lurking in every shadow. Yet, for the first time since he had found the child, the Apache scout felt a strange sense of purpose replacing the usual tension of survival. The fragile life in his arms had become both a responsibility and a lifeline, tethering him to something greater than the harsh solitude of the desert. The child's small hands clung to his tunic, timid but determined, as if instinctively seeking reassurance. Every tremor, every shiver, reflected fear, but also hope. The scout spoke softly, a steady, measured rhythm to his words, letting them wrap around the child like a protective cocoon. "It's all right. You're safe now." He repeated it gently over and over, each time watching the child's wide eyes search his face for proof. Slowly, cautiously, the child began to relax. Tiny fingers loosened their grip, and the tremble of fear gave way to a tentative trust. It was a fragile connection, delicate and easily broken, yet it held a profound weight. The scout understood that this was not just survival, it was the beginning of something more. The child had given him trust, and he would honor it with every step he took across the barren land. They moved together, the scout keeping low and alert, scanning the horizon for threats. Each step was deliberate, measured, yet the burden of care felt natural now, as though the desert had been waiting for this moment to test him in a new way. He noticed the child's eyes following his every move, reflecting both wonder and fear, and he realized that the fragile bond forming between them was as much about guidance as it was about protection. In this quiet, sun-drenched wilderness, small gestures became monumental. A gentle pat on the back, a soothing word, the way he adjusted the blanket to shield the child from the wind, all these acts were small, almost invisible, yet they forged a trust stronger than words. The desert, once a place of endless hardship, now seemed to cradle them in its vast expanse, a neutral witness to the beginning of their fragile relationship. The child, still clutching the scout, whispered the word again, "Mama," and this time it was different. It was no longer a cry of fear or desperation. It was tentative, almost questioning, as if testing the waters of this new bond. The scout met the gaze, letting the silence between them carry meaning, and slowly, carefully, he nodded. The unspoken promise was clear. He would protect, guide, and never abandon this small life entrusted to him. For the scout, the moment was transformative. The desert could be cruel, unpredictable, and merciless, yet it had offered him this chance, a chance to connect, to redeem, and to safeguard something precious. Every instinct he had honed for survival now intertwined with a deeper understanding of responsibility and care. The fragile connection between them was not just emotional. It was a lifeline, an anchor in a world otherwise defined by peril. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the scout tightened his hold on the child and continued onward. Each step was careful, each movement deliberate, yet the burden no longer felt heavy. The trust forming between them was delicate, fragile, but it was real, and in the vast, empty desert, that fragile connection had become the most important thing in the world. Together, they moved forward, bound by necessity, trust, and the quiet promise of protection, each word, each gesture slowly building the foundation of something that could survive even in the harshest of lands. The sun dipped below the mesas, bathing the desert in a fiery glow that slowly surrendered to twilight. Shadows stretched long across the cracked earth, and the wind carried a chill, reminding the Apache scout that the desert never truly slept. The child nestled in his arms shivered slightly, and he adjusted the blanket, holding them close against the creeping cold. For a long moment he stood still, scanning the horizon. Every instinct screamed caution. Dangers lurked everywhere, from hostile men to predators to the unforgiving terrain itself. The desert had tested him before, but now the stakes were higher than ever. This small, fragile life depended entirely on him. One wrong step, one lapse in vigilance, could mean disaster, and yet, amidst the danger, a clarity settled in him. The child's whispered plea, "Mama," had transformed from a word of fear into a call for protection, trust, and connection. The scout understood that leaving the child, however tempting for the sake of speed or safety, was no longer an option. He could not abandon them to the desert, nor could he pretend that this fragile life was someone else's responsibility. The scout shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly in the sand, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would take the child with him, guide them through the desert, and protect them from whatever threats might come. Survival alone was no longer enough. He had a duty now, not just to himself, but to this small being who had unknowingly tethered their fates together. As darkness settled over the desert, he moved forward, each step deliberate, careful, yet infused with purpose. The child, sensing his resolve, nestled closer, their small hands clutching his tunic with newfound trust. The desert, indifferent as ever, stretched out before them, but the weight of danger no longer felt paralyzing. Together, they would face it. The scout's mind wandered briefly to the past, the choices, mistakes, and regrets that had brought him here. He understood now that redemption was not something given, but something earned through action, courage, and care. The child in his arms was both a test and a chance, a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed empty and cruel. Night fell fully, stars piercing the dark canopy above, and the desert air grew sharp and cold. The scout adjusted the child again, whispering words of reassurance he wasn't sure they fully understood, but that carried all the weight of his commitment. "You are safe. I will not let anything happen to you." For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe it. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger, and uncertain. Yet in this moment there was purpose, connection, and a fragile sense of hope that glimmered brighter than the desert stars. The decision had been made. The Apache scout would not walk this desert alone again. With the child in his arms and the quiet promise of protection binding them together, he disappeared into the shadows of the desert, moving forward not just as a survivor, but as a guardian. The wind whispered through the cacti, carrying the echo of that single word, Mama, as a beacon of trust, responsibility, and the fragile bond that now defined both their fates. In the endless, indifferent desert, they were no longer merely alone. They were together, and in that togetherness there was hope.